The October rain drummed against the windows of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church as Grace Henderson stood in the doorway, her simple black dress clinging to her trembling frame. She clutched a single white rose, the same flower David had given her on their first anniversary 15 years ago. Today, she would place it on his casket and say goodbye to the only man who had ever truly seen her worth. I wonder where you're watching this from today. Whether you're in a small town like Millfield where this story takes place, or in a bustling city, I bet you've experienced that feeling of not quite fitting in somewhere. Comment below and let me know what state or country you're watching from, because Grace's story of being underestimated might feel familiar no matter where you call home. Eleanor Henderson swept past Grace without acknowledgement, her designer black coat billowing dramatically as she took command of the church entrance. At 72, Eleanor possessed the kind of imperious presence that could silence a room with a single glance. Her silver hair was pulled into a perfect chignon, and her jewelry caught the light from the stained glass windows as she began directing the funeral proceedings like a seasoned conductor. David's death had been sudden. A heart attack at 58, just like his father before him. Grace had found him in his study, slumped over the mahogany desk where he spent countless evenings working on what he called his legacy projects. The paramedics said he died instantly, but Grace wondered if he had called out for her in those final moments. She would never know. Eleanor positioned herself at the front of the church, accepting condolences from the steady stream of mourners who filed past David's casket. Business associates, family friends, distant relatives Grace had met only once or twice during her marriage. Each person approached Eleanor as if she were the grieving widow, offering their sympathies and sharing memories of David's childhood, his college years, his early career successes. Grace remained near the back, watching as Eleanor recounted story after story about her son's achievements. The successful construction company he had built from nothing, the charitable foundations he supported, the way he had always been destined for greatness, even as a young boy. Eleanor's voice carried across the church as she spoke to clusters of mourners, her words painting David as a self-made man who had overcome every obstacle through sheer determination and family values. What Eleanor never mentioned was Grace. In the 3 hours since the service began, Grace's name had not passed her mother-in-law's lips once. It was as if the woman David had shared his bed with for 15 years, the woman who had supported him through late-night business crises and celebrated every victory by his side, simply did not exist. The Reverend called for everyone to take their seats, and Grace moved toward the front pew where she assumed she would sit beside Eleanor. Instead, Eleanor's sister Margaret slid into the space next to her, followed by David's cousin Robert and his wife. Grace found herself directed to the third row, sandwiched between David's old college roommate and a business associate whose name she couldn't remember. During the service, Eleanor rose to deliver the eulogy. She spoke about David's dedication to family traditions, his commitment to the Henderson legacy, and his generous spirit that touched everyone he met. She shared amusing anecdotes about his childhood and praised his business acumen, describing him as a man who never forgot his roots or abandoned his principles. "My beloved son David," Eleanor said, her voice strong despite the tears that glistened in her eyes, lived his life with purpose and integrity. He built something lasting, something that will continue to honor our family name for generations to come. David understood that true success comes from hard work, not shortcuts or convenient arrangements. The words stung Grace like a slap across the face. Convenient arrangements. She knew Eleanor's subtle language well enough to understand the implication. Grace was not family in Eleanor's eyes. She was something temporary, something that would naturally fade away now that David was gone. After the service, the mourners gathered in the church fellowship hall for the reception. Long tables were draped with white linens and decorated with lilies and roses. Eleanor had arranged for catering from the country club where she held her bridge games, and uniformed servers moved through the crowd offering hors d'oeuvres and coffee. Grace approached one of the servers, intending to help ensure everyone had what they needed. It seemed natural to her to pitch in, to make sure David's friends and family were comfortable during this difficult time. Instead, Eleanor intercepted her with a firm grip on her arm. "Grace, dear," Eleanor said, her voice saccharine sweet, but her eyes cold as winter steel, "I think it would be best if you helped in the kitchen." You know how these things can be overwhelming when you're not used to entertaining proper company. The words hit Grace like a physical blow, but she simply nodded and made her way toward the kitchen. Behind the swinging doors, she found herself among the actual catering staff, professional servers who assumed she was part of their team. She spent the next 2 hours washing dishes, refilling serving platters, and ensuring the coffee urns remained full. Through the service window, Grace could see Eleanor holding court in the main hall, surrounded by admirers who hung on her every word about David's accomplishments. Robert was regaling a group with stories about David's high school football career. Margaret was showing photographs from family vacations where Grace was notably absent, explaining to anyone who would listen that David had always been the golden child who could have had any woman he wanted. As the afternoon wore on, Grace began collecting empty plates and glasses from the tables. Most of the mourners barely glanced at her as she worked, treating her like part of the furniture. A few offered polite thanks, but their attention quickly returned to their conversations about David's business success and the family's prominent position in the community. Eleanor approached Grace near the end of the reception, carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. Her smile was sharp as a blade as she handed it to Grace in full view of the remaining guests. "I thought you might need this," Eleanor said, her voice loud enough for nearby conversations to pause. "Since you'll be helping with the cleanup and all, I noticed you didn't bring anything appropriate to change into." Grace unwrapped the package with trembling fingers, her heart sinking as she realized what Eleanor had given her. It was a gray uniform dress with white collar and cuffs, the kind worn by domestic staff in upscale households. A small white apron was folded beneath it, along with a pair of sensible black shoes in what appeared to be Grace's size. Eleanor had planned this moment carefully, Grace realized. She had purchased this uniform specifically for today, specifically to humiliate Grace in front of everyone who mattered in David's life. The message was unmistakable. Grace belonged in the servants' quarters, not in the family circle. "I thought it would be more comfortable for you," Eleanor continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "You always seemed so much more at ease when you were helping out rather than trying to keep up with conversations about business and family matters. David used to worry that social situations made you uncomfortable." The assembled guests watched in fascinated horror as Grace held the uniform dress against her chest. Some looked embarrassed by Eleanor's cruel display, while others nodded approvingly as if Eleanor was simply being practical about an awkward situation. Margaret whispered something to Robert that made him chuckle softly. Grace felt every eye in the room focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this ultimate humiliation. Her husband was barely in the ground, and his mother was already making it clear that Grace's place in the family structure was about to change dramatically. "Thank you," Grace said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness, Eleanor. I'll certainly keep this in mind for future occasions." Eleanor's smile widened with satisfaction. "I thought you might. We'll talk soon about the arrangements, dear. I know David would want to make sure you're taken care of properly." Grace nodded and excused herself to the bathroom, the uniform still clutched in her hands. She locked the door and stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing a woman who looked far older than her 43 years. The stress of David's illness, his sudden death, and now Eleanor's calculated cruelty had carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth. She reached into her small black purse and pulled out a business card that had been tucked inside for the past 3 weeks. "James Morrison, attorney at law." David had given her the card shortly before his death, pressing it into her palm with an urgency she hadn't understood at the time. "Call him after the funeral," David had whispered during one of his lucid moments at the hospital. "Promise me you'll call him, Grace. There are things, important things, that Eleanor doesn't know. James will explain everything." Grace had promised, though she hadn't understood what David meant. Now, standing in the church bathroom, while Eleanor orchestrated her public humiliation just yards away, Grace began to suspect that her late husband had prepared for this moment. The business card felt warm in her palm as she traced the embossed lettering with her fingertip. She returned to the fellowship hall to find that most of the guests had departed. Eleanor was directing the cleanup with military efficiency, pointing out spots the catering staff had missed and ensuring every trace of the reception was erased. Grace folded the uniform carefully and placed it in her purse, a reminder of this moment that she would never forget. Tomorrow, Grace decided, she would make that phone call. Whatever David had wanted James Morrison to tell her, she was finally ready to hear it. Today had shown her exactly where she stood in Eleanor's world, but perhaps tomorrow would reveal where she actually belonged in David's. The Henderson family home sat on 3 acres of manicured grounds overlooking Millfield's exclusive Riverside district. David had inherited the Tudor-style mansion from his father, and Eleanor had maintained it as a shrine to Henderson family legacy for over 2 decades. Tonight, the house buzzed with quiet conversation as the extended family gathered to discuss David's estate and what Eleanor diplomatically called the transition period. Grace found herself directed to the kitchen table while the family assembled in the formal dining room. Through the swinging door, she could hear the scraping of chairs as Eleanor's siblings, David's cousins, and various other relatives settled themselves around the mahogany table that had hosted Henderson family meetings for generations. Grace sat alone at the small breakfast table where she had shared countless morning conversations with David, sipping coffee from a chipped mug while the good china clinked softly in the next room. Eleanor's voice carried clearly through the door as she called the informal meeting to order. She thanked everyone for staying after the reception and apologized for gathering them so soon after the service, but she explained that certain practical matters could not wait. David's death, while tragic, had left some complicated situations that required immediate family attention and collective decision-making. Poor David, Eleanor began, her voice heavy with maternal sorrow, made some choices in his personal life that we all hoped he would eventually reconsider. I think we can all agree that he married beneath himself, but he was such a generous soul that he couldn't see what was obvious to everyone else. The girl trapped him with sympathy and neediness, and David was too kind-hearted to extricate himself from the situation. Margaret murmured agreement, adding that she had tried to warn David years ago about getting involved with someone so far outside their social circle. She recounted how she had attempted to introduce David to several appropriate young women from established families, but by then it was too late. Grace had already gotten her claws into him. Robert's wife, Susan, shared her perspective about Grace's behavior at family gatherings over the years. She described Grace as awkward and out of place, clearly uncomfortable around people of breeding and education. Susan recalled numerous occasions when Grace would excuse herself early from dinner parties or family celebrations, claiming headaches or fatigue, but obviously intimidated by conversations about art, literature, travel, and business matters that were beyond her comprehension. The family's narrative about Grace began to crystallize as each person contributed their observations and concerns. They painted a picture of a simple secretary who had worked in David's office and gradually manipulated his sympathetic nature. Eleanor revealed that she had done some discreet investigating into Grace's background shortly after David announced their engagement, and what she discovered had confirmed all her worst suspicions. Grace came from nothing, Eleanor explained to the assembled relatives. Her father was a maintenance worker at the community college, and her mother cleaned houses for a living. She had no college education, no family connections, no social graces whatsoever. David hired her as a filing clerk when his regular secretary went on maternity leave, and somehow she convinced him that he was responsible for her welfare. The family listened with fascination as Eleanor described what she characterized as Grace's calculated campaign to ensnare David. She had played the helpless victim, Eleanor claimed, constantly needing David's assistance with everything from car repairs to apartment deposits. She would stay late at the office, creating opportunities for private conversations where she could share sob stories about her financial struggles and family problems. Eleanor had witnessed this manipulation firsthand, she told them, during the early months of David and Grace's relationship. She would call David's office and Grace would answer, always making excuses for why David couldn't come to the phone immediately. She was monitoring his calls, Eleanor believed, gradually isolating him from family and friends who might point out what was really happening. Margaret asked about Grace's behavior during the marriage, whether she had shown any signs of understanding her place in the family structure. Eleanor sighed deeply before explaining that Grace had always been presumptuous about her role in family matters. She would offer opinions about business decisions despite having no relevant knowledge or experience. She would attempt to participate in conversations about family history and traditions as if she had any right to comment on Henderson legacy issues. The most troubling aspect, Eleanor continued, was Grace's obvious expectation that she would inherit David's share of the family assets. She had been asking questions about property deeds and business ownership for months before David's death, clearly preparing to stake claims that she had no legitimate right to pursue. Eleanor had tried to warn David about this gold-digging behavior, but he refused to listen to reason. Robert wondered aloud whether David had made any legal provisions for Grace in his will. Eleanor smiled grimly as she explained that she had encouraged David to establish a modest trust fund that would provide Grace with a small monthly allowance, enough to maintain a simple lifestyle, but nothing approaching the resources she had been accustomed to during her marriage. The trust would be managed by Eleanor herself, ensuring that Grace couldn't waste David's hard-earned money on frivolous purchases or questionable investments. The family expressed relief that Eleanor had taken such precautions. Susan mentioned her concern that Grace might try to claim ownership of the family home or David's portion of the construction business. Margaret worried that Grace might attempt to insert herself into family gatherings and special occasions where she clearly didn't belong. Robert suggested that they should make it clear to Grace that her connection to the Henderson family ended with David's death. Eleanor assured them that she had everything well in hand. She had already spoken with the family attorney about the proper procedures for transitioning Grace out of the main residence and into more suitable accommodations. Grace would have 30 days to collect her personal belongings and find alternative housing, though Eleanor was prepared to be generous with the timeline if Grace proved cooperative and understanding about her changed circumstances. The conversation turned to David's personal possessions and how they should be distributed among family members who could properly appreciate their significance. Eleanor had already identified several items that should return to their rightful place in the extended family. David's father's watch should go to Robert as the eldest male cousin. The family photographs and documents should be preserved by Eleanor for future Henderson generations. David's clothing could be donated to charity, except for a few special pieces that might fit Robert or his teenage sons. Margaret asked whether Grace might expect to keep any of David's belongings as mementos. Eleanor paused thoughtfully before explaining that while she wanted to be compassionate about Grace's loss, it would be inappropriate to allow someone outside the family to retain items of sentimental or monetary value. Grace could perhaps keep a few small personal items that had no significance to blood relatives, but anything of real importance needed to remain within the Henderson lineage. Through the kitchen door, Grace listened to this systematic dismantling of her life and marriage with growing numbness. She had expected Eleanor's coldness, but hearing the entire family participate in rewriting David's story was more devastating than she had imagined. They spoke about her as if she were a con artist who had somehow fooled David for 15 years, rather than the woman who had shared his dreams, fears, and daily struggles. She thought about the countless evenings when David would come home exhausted from dealing with difficult contractors or demanding clients, and how she would listen to his frustrations while massaging the tension from his shoulders. She remembered the nights when he couldn't sleep because of business problems, and how they would sit in his study working through solutions together until dawn. She recalled the way his face would light up when she offered insights about employee management or client relations, insights that Eleanor apparently believed came from nowhere. The family's conversation continued for another hour as they worked through the practical details of Grace's departure and the redistribution of David's assets. Eleanor mentioned that she had already contacted a modest apartment complex on the other side of town where Grace could find suitable housing within her new budget constraints. Margaret volunteered to help Grace sort through David's clothing to identify items appropriate for charity donation. Robert offered to arrange for a moving truck to transport Grace's belongings once she had found permanent accommodations. As the meeting began to wind down, Eleanor reminded everyone that they should be kind but firm with Grace during this transition period. She was undoubtedly emotional about losing the comfortable lifestyle that David had provided, but it was important not to encourage unrealistic expectations about her future relationship with the family. A clean break would be better for everyone involved, including Grace herself. The relatives began filing out of the dining room, offering Eleanor hugs and words of support for the difficult decisions she was having to make. Several family members paused in the kitchen doorway to offer Grace polite but distant condolences before heading to their cars. Their expressions were sympathetic but guarded, as if they were looking at someone who had been caught in an embarrassing lie. After the last relative departed, Eleanor began clearing the dining room while Grace remained at the kitchen table. The house felt cavernous and cold now that the buffer of other people had disappeared. Grace could hear Eleanor moving through the rooms, straightening cushions and collecting coffee cups with her usual methodical efficiency. Eleanor eventually joined Grace in the kitchen, settling into the chair across from her with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully managed a difficult situation. She explained that she had tried to handle everything as delicately as possible, given the circumstances, but certain realities could not be ignored indefinitely. Grace's life was about to change dramatically, and the sooner she accepted that fact, the smoother the transition would be for everyone. Grace listened to Eleanor's practical advice about apartment hunting and budget management without responding. She thought about the business card tucked in her purse and wondered what David had wanted James Morrison to tell her. For the first time since David's death, Grace felt a flicker of curiosity about what secrets her husband might have been keeping. "I need to make a phone call," Grace said quietly, rising from the table. Eleanor nodded approvingly, assuming that Grace was finally accepting the need to start making practical arrangements for her new life. She offered to help Grace research suitable apartments and suggested that they could visit some properties together later in the week. Grace excused herself and climbed the stairs to David's study, closing the door behind her with a soft click. She sat in David's leather chair and pulled out James Morrison's business card, tracing the embossed letters with her fingertip as she had done at the church. Whatever David had wanted her to know, she was finally ready to hear it. The conversation downstairs had shown her exactly what the Henderson family thought of her contributions to David's life, but perhaps it was time to discover what David himself had really believed. David's study remained exactly as he had left it the night before his heart attack. His reading glasses sat folded beside an open legal journal, and his fountain pen lay uncapped next to a half-finished letter to a business associate. The familiar scent of his cologne still lingered in the leather chair where Grace now sat, James Morrison's business card trembling in her fingers. She had avoided this room for the 3 days since David's death, unable to face the overwhelming presence of his absence. Now, surrounded by the books and papers that had consumed so much of his attention during their marriage, Grace felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. This was where David had made the decisions that shaped their life together, and perhaps it was appropriate that she should make this crucial phone call from the same desk. Grace dialed the number with careful precision, her heart racing as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a professional male voice answered. "Morrison and Associates. This is James Morrison speaking." "Mr. Morrison," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Grace Henderson, David Henderson's wife. You gave him your card a few weeks ago and asked him to have me call after the funeral." "Mrs. Henderson," James Morrison's voice immediately warmed with genuine sympathy. "I was so sorry to hear about David's passing. He was not only a valued client, but someone I had come to consider a good friend. Please accept my deepest condolences for your loss." "Thank you," Grace replied, surprised by the lawyer's personal tone. Most of David's business associates had offered her polite but distant sympathy at the funeral, treating her like a peripheral figure in David's professional life. Morrison's warmth felt different, more respectful somehow. "I've been expecting your call," Morrison continued. "David was very specific about the timing of our conversation. He wanted to make sure you had time to process your grief before dealing with these matters. But he also emphasized that certain arrangements couldn't wait indefinitely. Are you ready to discuss what he wanted me to share with you?" Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. Even in death, David had been thinking about protecting her from additional stress while ensuring that important business was handled properly. This consideration felt like a final gift from her husband, a reminder that someone had truly understood her needs and feelings. "Yes," Grace said, her voice growing steadier. "I think I'm ready now. David said there were important things that Eleanor doesn't know about. Things you would explain to me." Morrison was quiet for a moment, and Grace could hear papers shuffling in the background. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something more formal and businesslike, though still respectful. "Mrs. Henderson," Morrison said carefully, "David spent considerable time over the past year ensuring that certain legal arrangements were properly documented and filed. He was concerned about potential complications that might arise after his death, particularly regarding family dynamics and assumptions that others might make about your legal position. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. David had known that Eleanor would try to marginalize her after his death. He had anticipated the humiliation she had endured today and had taken steps to prepare for it. The realization that her husband had foreseen Eleanor's cruelty was both comforting and heartbreaking. "What kind of arrangements?" Grace asked, though she was beginning to suspect that David's preparations went far beyond anything she had imagined. Morrison's voice took on the careful precision of someone discussing complex legal matters. "Without going into details over the phone, I can tell you that David has been very thorough in documenting your actual role in his business enterprises. He wanted to ensure that your contributions would be legally recognized and protected, regardless of what other family members might believe about your involvement in his affairs." Grace's hand tightened around the phone receiver. Her contributions to David's business? Eleanor and the family had spent the entire evening discussing Grace as if she had been nothing more than a secretary who had somehow tricked David into marriage. What contributions was Morrison referring to? "I think we should meet in person to review everything properly," Morrison continued. David left very specific instructions about how these revelations should be handled, and he wanted to make sure you had professional support during what might be some difficult conversations with his family. "Would tomorrow morning work for you? I can come to the house if that would be more convenient." Grace glanced at the study door, wondering if Eleanor was somewhere in the house listening for signs of her activities. The thought of Morrison arriving with legal documents would certainly create questions that Grace wasn't prepared to answer yet. "Yes," Grace said, her voice surprising her with its newfound determination. "Tomorrow morning would be perfect. What time should I expect you?" "Let's say 10 o'clock, Morrison replied. "That should give us plenty of time to review all the documentation before any other family members might want to discuss estate matters." David was quite specific that you should understand your full legal position before anyone else attempts to make decisions about your future. After ending the call, Grace sat in David's chair for several minutes, trying to process what Morrison had implied. David had documented her contributions to his business enterprises. He had anticipated problems with his family and had taken steps to protect her legal position. These were not the actions of a man whose wife was simply an office secretary who had somehow manipulated him into marriage. Grace thought back over their 15-year relationship, remembering the countless evenings when David had asked for her input on business decisions. He would spread contracts and financial reports across the dining room table while she reviewed the terms and pointed out potential problems or opportunities. At the time, Grace had assumed he was simply being polite by including her in his work discussions. Now she wondered if there had been something more systematic about their collaboration. She remembered the way David would defer to her judgment on personnel matters, especially when dealing with difficult employees or clients. Grace had always been good at reading people, at understanding the underlying motivations behind their behavior, and David had learned to trust her insights even when they contradicted his initial impressions. Had those conversations been more than just casual advice between spouses? The study door opened suddenly, causing Grace to jump in her chair. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her expression curious and slightly suspicious as she took in Grace's position behind David's desk. "I heard you on the phone," Eleanor said, stepping into the room without invitation. "I hope you're beginning to make those practical arrangements we discussed. The sooner you start looking for suitable housing, the easier this transition will be for everyone." Grace slipped Morrison's business card back into her pocket and stood up from David's chair. She felt awkward being caught in what Eleanor clearly considered the inner sanctum of Henderson family business, a space where Grace had no legitimate claim to be conducting personal affairs. "I was just making some necessary calls," Grace replied carefully. "There are several matters that David wanted me to handle personally." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of matters?" "I hope you understand that most of David's business affairs will need to be handled through the proper legal channels. You shouldn't attempt to contact his clients or associates directly without appropriate guidance." Grace felt a flicker of irritation at Eleanor's presumptuous tone. Just because Eleanor had decided to treat Grace like an incompetent child didn't mean that Grace had to accept that characterization without question. "David made it very clear what he wanted me to do," Grace said, her voice remaining calm, but carrying a subtle edge that made Eleanor pause. "I'm simply following his instructions." "What instructions?" Eleanor demanded, her maternal authority slipping into something sharper and more demanding. "David never mentioned any special instructions to me, and I was his closest family advisor on all important matters." Grace met Eleanor's stare without flinching. Perhaps there were some things that David preferred to handle privately. "I'm sure you can understand that a husband might have personal matters that he wouldn't necessarily discuss with his mother." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Eleanor's face flushed slightly as she realized that Grace had just claimed a level of intimacy with David that excluded Eleanor herself. It was the first time Grace had ever asserted her position as David's wife over Eleanor's position as his mother. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, the doorbell rang downstairs. Both women froze, neither expecting visitors so late in the evening after the exhausting day of funeral and family meetings. Eleanor glanced at her watch with obvious confusion before heading downstairs to answer the door. Grace followed at a distance, curious about who might be calling at such an unusual time. She could hear Eleanor's voice from the foyer, polite but questioning, followed by a deeper male voice that spoke with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. "Mrs. Eleanor Henderson," the male voice said. "I'm James Morrison, attorney with Morrison & Associates. I apologize for the late hour, but I wanted to drop off some documents that Mrs. Grace Henderson will need to review tonight before our meeting tomorrow morning." Grace felt her heart skip a beat. Morrison had decided to deliver the papers in person, creating exactly the kind of confrontation that Grace had hoped to avoid until she better understood what David had arranged. Eleanor's voice carried a note of confusion and growing suspicion. "I'm not aware of any legal meetings that Grace has scheduled. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about David's estate arrangements. I've been handling all the family's legal matters with our longtime attorney, Richard Pemberton. Mr. Pemberton handles the family trust and estate planning," Morrison replied smoothly. "I represent Mrs. Henderson in her individual capacity regarding certain business matters that are separate from the Henderson family holdings. If Mrs. Henderson is available, I'd like to deliver these documents personally and schedule our appointment for tomorrow." Grace appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down at Eleanor's stunned expression and Morrison's professional demeanor in the foyer below. Morrison was a tall man in his 50s, impeccably dressed despite the late hour, carrying a leather briefcase that looked substantial enough to contain significant documentation. "Mr. Morrison," Grace said, descending the stairs with a composure that surprised even herself. "Thank you for coming by this evening. I appreciate you taking the time to handle this personally." Eleanor's eyes darted between Grace and Morrison, her mind clearly racing to understand what kind of legal business Grace could possibly have that would require private representation. The Henderson family had always used Richard Pemberton for all legal matters, and Eleanor had assumed that arrangement would continue unchanged after David's death. Morrison handed Grace a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. "David's instructions were very specific about the timing of this delivery," he said. "These documents require your review tonight, and I'll answer any questions you have when we meet tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Grace accepted the envelope, feeling its unexpected weight in her hands. Whatever David had wanted Morrison to share with her, it was substantial enough to require extensive documentation and careful legal preparation. "Mrs. Henderson," Morrison continued, addressing Eleanor directly but respectfully, "I want to assure you that these matters don't interfere with the estate proceedings that Mr. Pemberton will be handling. These are separate business issues that David wanted resolved independently of family considerations." Eleanor's expression had hardened into something approaching alarm. She was beginning to realize that Grace's phone call hadn't been about apartment hunting or job searching. Something much more complicated was happening, something that David had arranged without Eleanor's knowledge or approval. "What business issues?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. Grace has never been involved in any business matters. She worked as David's secretary before they married, but she had no role in actual business operations. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at Eleanor's characterization of Grace's background, and for the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely surprised. He glanced at Grace with something approaching confusion before his expression cleared and he smiled politely at Eleanor. I think tomorrow's meeting will clarify any misunderstandings about Mrs. Henderson's business involvement, Morrison said diplomatically. David left very detailed records that should answer all your questions about the scope and nature of her contributions to his enterprises. The lawyer excused himself after confirming the next morning's appointment, leaving Grace and Eleanor standing in the foyer with the sealed envelope between them like an unexploded bomb. Eleanor's eyes fixed on the package with obvious suspicion, while Grace clutched it protectively against her chest. "Grace," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a warning tone that Grace had learned to recognize over the years. "I hope you understand that David's generosity toward you is based on emotion, not business judgment. Whatever he may have promised you, the family's legal obligations are limited to what's actually documented through proper channels." Grace met Eleanor's stare with newfound confidence, the weight of Morrison's envelope giving her strength she hadn't felt since David's death. Perhaps it was time to discover exactly what David had documented through his proper channels. Grace spent the night reading through Morrison's documents by lamplight in David's study, her coffee growing cold as she absorbed the magnitude of what her husband had prepared. The manila envelope contained copies of contracts, incorporation papers, property deeds, and financial statements that painted a picture of her life completely at odds with the narrative Eleanor's family had constructed downstairs. By dawn, Grace understood why David had insisted she wait until after the funeral to learn the truth. At precisely 10 o'clock, James Morrison arrived at the Henderson house carrying an expanded briefcase and a calm professional demeanor that suggested he was prepared for whatever reactions his revelations might provoke. Eleanor answered the door with barely concealed hostility, having spent a sleepless night worrying about what Grace might have discovered in those sealed documents. "Mr. Morrison," Eleanor said stiffly, "I hope this meeting will clear up any confusion about Grace's expectations regarding David's estate. Our family attorney, Mr. Pemberton, has assured me that all proper arrangements were made through the appropriate legal channels." Morrison smiled politely as he followed Eleanor into the living room where she had insisted the meeting take place rather than in David's private study. "I'm confident that today's discussion will indeed clarify everyone's understanding of the legal arrangements," he replied, settling his briefcase on the coffee table with practiced efficiency. Grace entered the room wearing a simple navy dress that somehow made her appear more composed and authoritative than Eleanor had ever seen her. There was something different about Grace's posture, a subtle straightening of her shoulders that suggested she was no longer the defeated widow who had accepted humiliation at yesterday's funeral. Eleanor had called Margaret and Robert early that morning, insisting they attend this meeting as witnesses to whatever nonsense Grace might be planning to claim. They sat stiffly on the sofa, their expressions skeptical and slightly annoyed at being summoned for what they assumed would be an embarrassing display of Grace's unrealistic expectations. Morrison opened his briefcase and arranged several manila folders on the coffee table with methodical precision. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, addressing Eleanor directly, "David asked me to begin by sharing some information that might surprise you about Grace's background and her role in his business enterprises over the past 15 years. Eleanor's eyebrows rose in apparent amusement. "Mr. Morrison, I think you may have been misinformed about Grace's qualifications. She worked as a temporary secretary in David's office when they met. She has no formal education beyond high school and no business experience outside of basic clerical work." Morrison paused in his document arrangement and looked at Eleanor with genuine curiosity. "Where did you get that information about Grace's educational background?" he asked politely. "Because David's records show something quite different." He opened the first folder and withdrew a diploma in an ornate frame, setting it carefully on the coffee table where everyone could see the Northwestern University seal and the inscription awarding Grace Elizabeth Hartwell a Master of Business Administration with highest honors. The graduation date was 2 years before Grace and David's marriage. Eleanor stared at the diploma as if it were a forgery, her face draining of color as she processed the implications. Margaret leaned forward to examine the document more closely, her expression shifting from skepticism to confusion. "This must be some kind of mistake," Eleanor said, her voice lacking its usual authority. "Grace never mentioned attending Northwestern. She never mentioned having an MBA at all. David would have told me if his wife had advanced business credentials." Morrison withdrew a thick folder labeled Employment History and opened it to reveal official transcripts, recommendation letters, and employment verification documents. Grace graduated summa cum laude with concentrations in corporate finance and strategic management, he explained matter-of-factly. She worked for 3 years at Hartwell Business Consulting before David hired her firm to analyze expansion opportunities for Henderson Construction. The room fell silent as Morrison continued laying out documents that systematically destroyed every assumption Eleanor's family had made about Grace's background. College transcripts showed a nearly perfect academic record in advanced business courses. Professional references described Grace as one of the most analytically gifted consultants they had ever worked with. Employment records documented her rapid promotion through increasingly responsible positions at prestigious consulting firms. Robert cleared his throat nervously. If Grace had these qualifications, why was she working as David's secretary when they met? That doesn't make any sense given her apparent education level. Morrison smiled as he opened another folder. She wasn't working as his secretary, Robert. Grace was the lead consultant assigned to evaluate David's business operations and recommend strategies for sustainable growth. Her analysis identified several inefficiencies in Henderson Construction's project management systems and suggested organizational changes that increased profitability by over 40% in the first year. Grace sat quietly watching Eleanor's face as the truth emerged piece by piece. She remembered those early months when David would joke about how his mother thought he was dating his secretary, but Grace had assumed he would eventually correct Eleanor's misunderstanding. Now she realized that David had deliberately allowed his family to maintain their incorrect assumptions about Grace's role in his life. Morrison opened a third folder containing corporate documentation. 6 months after Grace completed her consulting contract, David offered her a partnership position in Henderson Construction. He was so impressed with her strategic insights that he wanted to ensure her continued involvement in the company's development. Eleanor's hands trembled as Morrison displayed the partnership agreement signed by both David and Grace, legally establishing her as co-owner of Henderson Construction with equal decision-making authority and profit-sharing arrangements. The document was notarized, filed with appropriate state agencies, and had been renewed annually for the past 14 years. "This is impossible," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. David never mentioned anything about a business partnership. Grace never acted like she owned part of the company. She never attended board meetings or participated in major decisions. Morrison glanced at Grace before responding. David and Grace made a mutual decision to keep her ownership private to avoid potential complications with family dynamics and client relationships. Grace participated in all major strategic decisions, but her involvement was handled through private consultations rather than public meetings. Margaret's voice cracked as she asked the question that was terrifying all of them. What exactly does this partnership entail? What kind of authority does Grace actually have? Morrison opened his largest folder and began spreading property deeds across the coffee table. Grace owns 50% of Henderson Construction, which includes all current contracts, equipment, and real estate holdings. She also owns 50% of the investment properties that the company has acquired over the past 15 years, including several commercial buildings and the vacation property in Colorado. Eleanor watched in growing horror as Morrison displayed deed after deed showing Grace's name alongside David's as co-owner of properties she had assumed belonged exclusively to the Henderson family legacy. The office building where Henderson Construction was headquartered. The warehouse complex where they stored equipment and materials. The mountain cabin where the family had spent summer vacations for over a decade. Robert's face had gone ashen as he realized the implications for his own employment. He had worked as a project manager for Henderson Construction for the past 8 years, assuming his family connection guaranteed his position and eventual promotion to company leadership. If Grace owned half the company, his job security depended entirely on her goodwill. Morrison wasn't finished with his revelations. He opened a final folder containing financial statements and tax returns that showed the true scope of Grace and David's shared assets. The documents revealed that Grace's business insights had been instrumental in diversifying Henderson Construction beyond basic contracting into property development, investment management, and strategic consulting services. Over the past 15 years, Morrison explained, Grace's strategic recommendations have increased the company's annual revenue from $2 million to over $15 million. Her analysis identified emerging market opportunities that allowed Henderson Construction to expand into commercial development and property investment sectors that now represent 60% of total company income. Eleanor's carefully constructed worldview crumbled as she confronted the reality that Grace hadn't been David's dependent secretary, but his equal business partner. Every family gathering where Eleanor had dismissed Grace's attempts to participate in business discussions now appeared in a horrifying new light. Grace had been listening to family members make ignorant pronouncements about strategies she had actually designed. Susan's voice came out as a strangled whisper. Does this mean Grace owns the family properties as well? What about Eleanor's house and the family trust assets? Morrison carefully separated the partnership documents from the family estate papers. The Henderson family trust assets remain separate from the business partnership, he clarified. However, several properties that the family may have assumed were trust holdings are actually owned jointly by Grace and David through their business partnership. He displayed the deed to Eleanor's house, which she had assumed David inherited from his father. Instead, the document showed that David and Grace had purchased the property from the family estate 12 years earlier, when Eleanor faced financial difficulties after her husband's death. The house where Eleanor had held court as Henderson family matriarch actually belonged to the woman she had just tried to banish with 30 days' notice. Eleanor's face crumpled as she realized that her own housing security depended on Grace's continued generosity. The home where she had entertained relatives and made pronouncements about Grace's inferior status was legally owned by the woman she had been systematically humiliating. Grace finally spoke, her voice calm and controlled in a way that none of them had ever heard before. David always hoped that eventually his family would come to respect me for my contributions rather than dismissing me because of assumptions about my background. He protected me legally while giving everyone time to get to know who I really was. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Why didn't you ever correct our misunderstandings? Why did you let us believe you were just David's secretary? Grace met Margaret's stare with quiet dignity. David and I discussed this many times over the years. We decided that respect that had to be demanded wasn't really respect at all. We hoped that eventually you would come to value me for my character and my treatment of David, not for my degrees or business ownership. Eleanor finally found her voice, though it carried none of its former authority. These documents, she said desperately, they could be forgeries. Grace could have had these papers created to support false claims about her relationship with David. Morrison reached into his briefcase and withdrew a letter in David's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Eleanor recognized her son's distinctive penmanship as Morrison read David's final instructions about Grace's legal position and his hopes that his family would finally understand her true worth. Eleanor sank into her chair as the magnitude of her misjudgment became clear. She had spent 15 years treating her son's business partner like an incompetent interloper, and now that same woman controlled Eleanor's housing, Robert's employment, and the family's financial future. The power dynamics she had assumed were permanent had been completely inverted by her own ignorance and prejudice. The silence in the living room stretched like a taut wire as Eleanor stared at the property deeds scattered across her coffee table. Each document represented another assumption shattered, another pillar of her understanding crumbling beneath the weight of Morrison's methodical revelations. Grace sat composed in the chair where she had endured yesterday's humiliation, but now the power dynamics had shifted so completely that Eleanor felt dizzy with the implications. Morrison cleared his throat gently, drawing everyone's attention back to his briefcase. "I'm afraid there are additional matters we need to discuss," he said, withdrawing another thick folder. Grace's educational background and business partnership with David represent only part of the picture that he wanted me to share with you. Grace finally spoke, her voice carrying an authority that none of them had ever heard before. "Before we continue, I think it's important for everyone to understand how David and I actually met. Mr. Morrison mentioned that I was working as a business consultant, but the full story might help explain some things that have confused the family over the years." Eleanor's eyes darted nervously between Grace and Morrison, sensing that another devastating revelation was approaching. Margaret and Robert leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by Grace's sudden transformation from quiet victim to confident narrator. I graduated from Harvard Business School in 1995 with a specialization in corporate restructuring and family business dynamics. Grace began, her voice steady and professional. I spent 5 years working for McKinsey & Company in their Chicago office, helping established companies adapt to changing market conditions and optimize their operational efficiency. Robert's mouth dropped open at the mention of McKinsey, one of the world's most prestigious consulting firms. Harvard Business School and McKinsey represented credentials that far exceeded anything the Henderson family had achieved, despite their assumptions about their own social and professional superiority. In 2000, Grace continued, I decided to start my own consulting practice specializing in construction and development companies that were struggling to scale their operations effectively. David's company was referred to me by his banker, who was concerned about some cash flow irregularities and strategic planning issues that were limiting Henderson Construction's growth potential. Eleanor felt another piece of her worldview cracking. David had never mentioned having business problems serious enough to require outside consulting. She had assumed that Henderson Construction's success was the result of David's natural business instincts and the solid foundation his father had provided. Morrison opened his folder and displayed a contract dated 15 years earlier. Grace's initial engagement with Henderson Construction was a 6-month comprehensive analysis of operations, financial management, and strategic positioning. Her report identified several critical areas where the company was underperforming relative to its market potential. Grace's voice took on the measured tone of someone delivering a professional presentation. Henderson Construction was generating about $2 million in annual revenue when I began working with David, but the profit margins were only about 8%, well below industry standards. The company was also heavily dependent on residential projects, which made it vulnerable to housing market fluctuations. She paused, watching Eleanor's face as the implications sank in. The family had always assumed that David's business success was a natural extension of Henderson family competence, but Grace was suggesting that the company had been struggling before her involvement. My analysis revealed that Henderson Construction had the foundation for much greater success, but it needed strategic restructuring and diversification to reach its potential. David was incredibly receptive to new ideas, and we worked together to implement changes that would transform the company's trajectory over the next several years. Morrison spread financial statements across the table, showing Henderson Construction's revenue progression year by year since Grace's involvement. The numbers told a story of systematic growth from $2 million to $4 million to $8 million, reaching $15 million in annual revenue by the previous year. These improvements weren't accidental, Morrison explained. Grace developed and implemented every major strategic initiative that drove the company's expansion. She identified the commercial development opportunities, structured the property investment partnerships, and designed the operational systems that allowed Henderson Construction to scale efficiently. Eleanor stared at the financial documents with growing horror. If Grace's strategies had been responsible for the company's success, then the comfortable lifestyle Eleanor had enjoyed for the past 15 years was entirely dependent on the business acumen of the woman she had been systematically dismissing and humiliating. Robert's voice cracked as he asked the question that was terrifying him most. What about our employment with the company? I've been working as a project manager for 8 years. Margaret's husband handles the equipment maintenance contracts. Susan does the bookkeeping for 3 of the subsidiary companies. Grace turned to look at Robert with an expression of mild surprise. Did you think those positions existed independently of the company's growth and success? The project management role you hold was created as part of the organizational restructuring I recommended in 2005. The equipment maintenance contracts exist because we expanded our fleet based on my analysis of operational efficiency needs. Margaret's face had gone pale as she realized that her family's financial security was entirely dependent on business decisions that Grace had been making for over a decade. The Henderson relatives weren't independent employees who happened to work for David's company. They were beneficiaries of Grace's strategic planning and David's generous implementation of her recommendations. Morrison withdrew another set of documents from his briefcase. There's also the matter of Eleanor's living arrangements and financial support, he said diplomatically. Grace and David were quite generous in ensuring that Eleanor could maintain her lifestyle after her husband's death, but I think it's important for everyone to understand the actual source of that generosity. Eleanor felt a chill of premonition as Morrison displayed bank statements showing monthly transfers from Henderson Construction to an account in Eleanor's name. The amounts were substantial, far more than Eleanor had ever acknowledged receiving, and the payments had been ongoing for over 12 years. When Eleanor faced financial difficulties after David's father died, Grace said quietly, David wanted to help without making her feel like she was accepting charity from her son. We structured the support as consulting payments for Eleanor's advice on family business matters, even though David and I were making all the actual strategic decisions. The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. For 12 years, she had been receiving what amounted to an allowance from Grace's business success, while simultaneously treating Grace like an incompetent interloper who had somehow tricked David into supporting her. Eleanor's comfortable lifestyle, her bridge club memberships, her designer clothes, her luxury car payments had all been subsidized by the woman she had just handed a cleaning uniform. Grace's gaze moved to the gray uniform dress that still hung over the back of Eleanor's chair, a stark reminder of yesterday's humiliation. She had left it there deliberately, Grace realized, as a symbol of how completely Eleanor had misunderstood the power dynamics in her own family. I want everyone to understand something very important, Grace said, her voice carrying quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. David loved his family deeply, and he always hoped that you would eventually come to accept me based on my character and my love for him. He never wanted me to use my business position as a weapon against people he cared about. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she began to comprehend the magnitude of her mistake. She had spent 15 years attacking and dismissing the woman who had been supporting her lifestyle and securing her family's employment. Grace could have corrected Eleanor's assumptions at any time, could have used her financial power to demand respect and recognition, but she had chosen patience and hope instead. However, Grace continued, her tone remaining steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. David also made it very clear that he expected his family to treat me with basic human dignity. Yesterday's events have shown me that hope for natural acceptance may have been unrealistic. Morrison began gathering the documents back into his folders, the legal evidence of Grace's true position disappearing back into their manila containers. Mrs. Henderson, he said to Eleanor, David's final instructions were very specific about how these revelations should affect family relationships going forward. He hoped that understanding Grace's actual contributions would help everyone appreciate what they've had the privilege of experiencing for the past 15 years. Eleanor looked around the living room that she now understood belonged to Grace, surrounded by family members whose livelihoods depended entirely on Grace's continued goodwill. The woman she had tried to banish with 30 days' notice controlled every aspect of the Henderson family's financial security and future prospects. Grace rose from her chair with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the devastating revelations. I need some time to consider how to proceed, she said simply. David hoped that his family would eventually respect me for who I really am, but he also prepared me to protect myself if that respect never developed. The gray cleaning uniform seemed to mock Eleanor from across the room as Grace walked toward the door, leaving the Henderson family to contemplate their complete dependence on the mercy of the woman they had so thoroughly underestimated and mistreated. 3 days later, Grace called a formal meeting in the Henderson Construction Conference Room, the same space where she and David had planned the company's most successful expansions. Eleanor arrived first, her usual imperious confidence replaced by nervous uncertainty as she took a seat at the polished mahogany table where she had never been invited during David's lifetime. Margaret and Robert followed, their faces reflecting the sleepless nights they had spent contemplating their precarious positions. Grace entered wearing a tailored charcoal business suit that transformed her completely from the grieving widow Eleanor had attempted to humiliate. Her hair was pulled back in a professional chignon, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of dollars and dozens of employees. She took her place at the head of the table, the same chair David had occupied during family discussions about business matters that Grace had actually orchestrated. James Morrison accompanied Grace, his briefcase containing the legal documentation that would formalize whatever decisions Grace had reached during her 3 days of deliberation. The weight of his presence reminded everyone that Grace's authority was not merely emotional or symbolic, but backed by irrefutable legal power that could reshape their lives with the stroke of a pen. "Thank you all for coming," Grace began, her voice carrying the measured tone of a seasoned executive addressing subordinates. "I've spent considerable time reflecting on David's hopes for this family and weighing them against the realities that recent events have made clear. I want to share my decisions about how we'll move forward together." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap, her eyes fixed on Grace with the desperate attention of someone whose entire future hung in the balance. The woman she had dismissed as an incompetent secretary now controlled Eleanor's housing, income, and social standing with absolute authority. "Let me begin with employment matters," Grace continued, opening a leather portfolio that contained what appeared to be official company documents. "Robert, your position as project manager has been valuable to Henderson Construction's operations, and I appreciate the effort you've invested in learning the systems that David and I developed over the years." Robert's relief was visible as Grace acknowledged his contributions, but he remained tense, sensing that conditions would be attached to his continued employment. His salary and benefits package supported not only his own family, but also helped subsidize Margaret's household expenses and Susan's part-time income from the company's subsidiary bookkeeping contracts. However, Grace's tone sharpened slightly. "Future employment decisions will be based on professional competence and respectful behavior toward all family members, including myself. The assumption that family connections guarantee job security regardless of performance or conduct is no longer valid under my management." She slid a revised employment contract across the table to Robert, the terms clearly more stringent than his previous informal arrangement with David. The document specified performance metrics, behavioral expectations, and regular review periods that would determine his continued employment with the company. "Margaret," Grace continued, "your husband's equipment maintenance contracts have been profitable for both parties, but they'll need to be rebid competitively against outside vendors to ensure we're receiving fair market value for our expenditures. Family relationships will no longer be sufficient justification for business arrangements that don't serve the company's best interests." Margaret nodded quickly, understanding that Grace was offering continued business relationships, but only on terms that reflected actual economic value rather than David's generous accommodation of family employment needs. The era of guaranteed income based solely on Henderson family membership was ending permanently. Grace turned to Eleanor with an expression that combined professional courtesy with unmistakable firmness. "Eleanor, your housing situation presents unique considerations given the length of your residence and David's emotional attachment to ensuring your comfort and security." Eleanor held her breath, knowing that Grace had every legal right to demand immediate evacuation from the house that Eleanor had assumed she owned outright. The humiliation of learning that she had been living in Grace's property while treating Grace like a servant was almost unbearable, but the prospect of homelessness made Eleanor's pride seem like a luxury she could no longer afford. "You may continue living in the house," Grace announced, watching Eleanor's shoulders sag with relief, "but your residence will be formalized through a written lease agreement that specifies both your rights and responsibilities as a tenant. The monthly consulting payments will also continue, but they'll be structured as genuine compensation for actual advisory services that contribute value to our business operations." Grace slid a lease agreement across the table that outlined rental terms significantly below market rate, but still substantial enough to emphasize Eleanor's dependent status. The consulting arrangement required Eleanor to provide monthly reports on community business trends and family networking opportunities that could benefit Henderson Construction's local reputation and client development. "Most importantly," Grace said, her voice carrying quiet steel, "all family interactions will be conducted with mutual respect and professional courtesy. The assumption that I should accept dismissive or condescending treatment because of misunderstandings about my background or qualifications is no longer tolerable." Eleanor's face flushed with shame as she realized Grace was directly referencing the cleaning uniform incident and the years of subtle humiliations that had preceded it. The gray uniform still hung in Eleanor's bedroom closet, a daily reminder of how catastrophically She had misjudged the power dynamics in her own family. Robert cleared his throat nervously before speaking. Grace, we all owe you an enormous apology for our assumptions and behavior over the years. We had no idea about your education or business contributions, and we allowed ourselves to make judgments based on incomplete information. Grace regarded Robert with an expression that suggested she appreciated his acknowledgement but wasn't entirely convinced of its sincerity. Apologies are a starting point, she replied, but real change requires consistent behavior over time. David always believed that people could grow and learn from their mistakes, and I'm willing to give everyone that opportunity. Margaret leaned forward with obvious desperation in her voice. What do we need to do to earn your trust and respect? How can we make up for the years of treating you so poorly? Grace considered the question carefully before responding. Start by treating me as an equal family member whose opinions and decisions deserve the same consideration you would give to any other business leader or relative. Stop making assumptions about my capabilities based on preconceptions about my background. Most importantly, remember that respect must be demonstrated through actions, not just words. Eleanor finally found her voice, though it carried none of its former authority. Grace, I've been incredibly wrong about you for 15 years, and I don't know how to begin making amends for that level of misjudgment. Is there anything specific I can do to prove that I understand how badly I've behaved? Grace looked at Eleanor with an expression that mixed sympathy with firm resolve. Eleanor, you can start by acknowledging that David's choice to marry me was based on love and partnership, not manipulation or deception. You can stop referring to our marriage as if I somehow tricked David into a relationship he didn't freely choose. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. You can also begin participating in family conversations with the understanding that I'm not an outsider trying to insert myself into Henderson family matters, but David's widow and business partner who has legitimate interests in our shared legacy. Morrison began distributing copies of the revised family employment contracts and Eleanor's lease agreement, making it clear that these arrangements were legally binding commitments rather than informal family accommodations. Grace's decisions would be enforced through proper legal channels if necessary, but she clearly hoped that formal documentation would prevent future misunderstandings. Grace stood and moved to the conference room window that overlooked the Henderson construction facility that she and David had built together. The warehouse complex, equipment yards, and office building represented 15 years of strategic planning and careful execution that had transformed David's modest construction company into a regional business empire. I want everyone to understand that these changes aren't motivated by revenge or a desire to punish you for past mistakes, Grace said, her back still turned to the family. David loved all of you deeply, and he would want me to preserve family relationships while protecting the business interests that secure everyone's future prosperity. She turned back to face the table, her expression showing both strength and compassion. But David also expected his family to recognize my contributions and treat me with the respect that any business partner and family member deserves. He hoped that respect would develop naturally over time, but he also prepared me to enforce appropriate boundaries if necessary. Robert signed his employment contract first, followed by Margaret's acceptance of the competitive bidding requirements for her husband's maintenance work. Eleanor's signature on the lease agreement was shaky but determined, reflecting her understanding that Grace's terms were generous given the circumstances and her own past behavior. As the meeting concluded, Grace made one final announcement. The family Sunday dinners that David enjoyed so much will resume next week, but they'll be held here at my home rather than being imposed on someone who's now technically a tenant rather than the hostess. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she realized that Grace was extending an invitation rather than issuing an ultimatum. Despite everything that had happened, Grace was offering the family an opportunity to rebuild their relationships on terms of genuine equality and mutual respect. The cleaning uniform will remain in your closet, Eleanor, Grace added quietly, not as a punishment, but as a reminder that assumptions about people's worth and capabilities can be dangerously wrong. David always hoped you would eventually see past your preconceptions to appreciate who I really am. Eleanor nodded through her tears, understanding that Grace was offering both accountability and redemption. The path forward would require earning back the respect she had forfeited through years of dismissive behavior. But Grace was providing that opportunity rather than simply severing all family connections. As everyone prepared to leave, Grace's voice took on a warmer tone for the first time since the meeting began. David believed that families grow stronger when they face difficulties together and learn from their mistakes. I'm committed to honoring that belief, but I also won't accept treatment that dishonors his memory or our partnership. Morrison packed his briefcase with the satisfaction of someone whose client had handled a difficult situation with both justice and grace. The legal documentation would protect Grace's interests while preserving family relationships that David had valued, striking a balance between accountability and forgiveness that reflected Grace's character and David's hopes. 6 months later, Eleanor knocked softly on the door of David's study where Grace was reviewing quarterly financial reports. The company had continued its upward trajectory under Grace's full leadership, adding 2 new commercial developments and expanding into sustainable construction technologies that Grace had been researching before David's death. "Mrs. Davidson," Eleanor said, using Grace's formal name with genuine respect, "I wanted to thank you for the patience you've shown with my learning curve. The community networking report took longer than expected, but I think you'll find some valuable leads for potential clients." Grace looked up from her computer screen with a smile that would have been impossible during those first traumatic days after David's funeral. Eleanor had indeed learned to treat Grace as a peer and business partner, contributing valuable insights about local business relationships that had helped Henderson Construction secure several profitable new contracts. "Thank you, Eleanor," Grace replied, accepting the monthly report that had become one of Eleanor's genuine contributions to the company's success. "David would be proud of how we've all learned to work together more effectively." Eleanor paused in the doorway, her expression thoughtful. "Grace, I want you to know that I finally understand what David saw in you from the beginning. Your strength, your intelligence, your capacity for forgiveness even when you had every right to be angry. I'm sorry it took me so long to recognize what should have been obvious from the start." Grace's smile widened as she realized that Eleanor's respect had finally become genuine rather than grudging acceptance of changed circumstances. The gray uniform still hung in Eleanor's closet, but now it served as a reminder of growth and learning rather than shame and regret. "I think David always knew that we'd figure it out eventually," Grace said softly. "He just hoped it wouldn't take a crisis to bring out the best in everyone. He believed in second chances and the possibility that people could surprise themselves with their capacity for change." As Eleanor left to prepare dinner for their weekly family gathering, Grace reflected on how dramatically their lives had transformed since that terrible day at the funeral. The family that had once dismissed her as an incompetent interloper now depended on her leadership and valued her contributions. But more importantly, they had learned to see her as David had always seen her, as someone worthy of love and respect. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in a situation where people completely underestimated your abilities or worth? Grace's story shows us that sometimes the quiet strength to endure disrespect can eventually transform into the power to demand better treatment. I'd love to hear about your own experiences with being underestimated in the comments below. Did you find your voice like Grace did, or are you still working on setting those important boundaries? Your story might inspire someone else who's facing a similar challenge.